So now we'll put it back together. There are a few things that you want to be aware of when you're putting it back together. The heat exchanger itself, that just slides right on back in. A little bit of wiggling. Keep the pipes out of the way. And then of course you're going to have this rubber grommet down here that you're going to want to seat into that slot. Now I'll usually stop a little bit short of getting this completely seated so I can get the grommet in place. Once I get this grommet in place, then I'll use the bolts to kind of drive it home. Now the burner tube and the burner tube gasket, and again, gaskets in different parts, they can't go in the wrong way. If you'll notice, let's turn this way. Let's turn this a little bit here. You kind of have a bit of almost a straight edge there. You see there's a similar straight edge there, so clearly this wouldn't go in this way. But if you flip it, just goes right in. And the burner tube itself, you got a little, I call it a corner, a little point right here. Let's see if you can see that. There we go. And if you look on the housing, there's a little bit of a point down at the bottom. So that's where it's going to line up. But if you're not sure, when you try to put it in upside down, it just doesn't work. Going to keep trying it a couple different ways, and eventually it'll find its way home. Remember, you only have 2 bolts at this point in time because the burner tube is held in with 2 bolts in the burner tube, but also there's the 2 bolts that go across the bar that holds the burner in. So we're going to put the 2 bolts for the burner tube in now, then we'll put the burner in next. So the burner is probably the hardest part of it all, and it's really not the burner so much as this grommet. This grommet fits into this hole here that you see. This hole that's there at the bottom of the housing, but you can see it's very, very close to the burner tube. So it's just a bit of a tight fit. I'll have to make sure I put that grommet in correctly later. Now, to get this grommet seated in there properly, I'll usually use a small pocket screwdriver. I'm trying to stay out of your way with my hands. It's kind of tough, but I'll use the screwdriver to push this grommet down into that hole. Just be careful not to tear the grommet. And there you have it sit. You just want to make sure that it's fully seated in the hole. Now you're ready for the bar that holds the burner in, and the 2 screws. That it's probably best to bring our glow plug wire through the hole. And you have another grommet to seat. So I'll usually start on the rear long edge, kind of get that part of the grommet sitting in there. Once you have that in there, I'll take my screwdriver and I'll work this front edge. Once you have it all seated, now it's time for this bar here. Now you can see both our glow plug grommet and our fuel line grommet are fully seated. Cross brace is installed. Burner's installed. Now it's ready to put the combustion air fan back in. So next is going to be our combustion air fan and of course the combustion air fan gasket. And again, as I've been saying, gaskets and parts only go on one way, one orientation. So again, with this situation, if you look at the gasket, remember we talked about the little corner, the little point in the burner tube gasket and the burner tube. There's a similar point on this gasket here. Also, you'll notice there's locating holes and there's locating dowels. So obviously, this one isn't going to go like this. Your locating dowels don't line up. Flip it around backwards. You got your locating dowels. You got your little point, and everything's good to go. So before I put the combustion air fan on, though, I always want to take a look at these glow plug wires to make sure they're not sticking up too far this way, too proud, because again, remember we talked about this earlier, you don't want them to rub on the bottom side of the combustion air fan. Now in this case, they're just a little bit proud of that bar, and that's okay. If they were considerably proud of it, you should hear it. I'm going to intentionally pull them out quite a bit. So next I'm going to put my combustion air fan on. Now what I do is I start with just 2 bolts, and I'll go across the combustion air fan. So maybe in this case I'm starting in the top right, and then I put one down here in the bottom left. Now the reason I'm doing this is because if I put the combustion air fan on all the way, and I put the heater together all the way, and then I realize that my glow plug wires were sticking out too far, well now I'm taking it all the way back apart to fix those glow plug wires. So in this case, I have 2 screws in, the fan's mostly bolted in place, and I give it a spin. Number 1, I can hear a noise. Number 2, the fan is not spinning very freely. That tells me my glow plug wires are pulled too far into the burner chamber. They're rubbing in the bottom of the combustion air fan. You don't necessarily have to take it back apart. Kind of give them a little bit of a tug. Now I knew how much I had to pull it because I set them in there, but pull it a little at a time, pull it gently. You see it spins a lot freer, but there's still a noise. There's no noise, spins free, so we're good to go. Now you can start putting in the rest of the screws. So now that they're all snugged, I'll just give them a little turn. People always ask what's the torque spec. There really isn't one that I've ever seen. Remember though, you're screwing steel into aluminum. You don't need to go crazy. I'm just using a 1/4-inch drive ratchet. And I'm just getting them snug. You're not really gonna compress that gasket very much, so no, you don't need much torque on it. So the next step is going to be the control module. Some people find it easier to plug in all the connections with the control module out. I have to agree that's not a bad way to go. So I'm going to plug in the main power and ground connections for the motor itself, the combustion air fan motor. Plugs in down there on the lower left as you're looking at the heater. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put one of the mounting bolts on the control module just because it keeps it a little bit more steady, makes it easier to plug in the rest of the connectors. I generally don't plug in the connectors with the control module loose. So now we have our internal wiring harness. And now in this case, because we're reinstalling the old harness, it kind of has a memory. The wires find themselves, back where they're supposed to be. If not, again, they only go on one position, and they only go in one orientation. So So the wires kind of have a memory, but even if you're installing a new harness, just remember the wires are only going to go on in one position, and they're only going to go on in one orientation, and they're going to slide on relatively easily. If you're having to force it or really struggle, you're probably in the wrong place. And here I'm kind of using my hands to feel where the holes are, because I know there's a large one down there for the glow plug, and then there's a much smaller one here. This one I'm going to tuck behind the harness under the grommet. Now that's all. You have one more connection, and that is it's the last mounting screw for the module. It's also for the ground wire for the internal harness. Remember, that's the screw that has the little star washer. So we're going to slide that through our ground. And now once this last mounting screw with our ground is installed, we can tighten the other one up. Now we have our purple and gray wire, which goes to our double gold wires, which, remember, that's for the combustion overheat sensor. All our wires are plugged in where they're supposed to be. So now with our internal wiring harness, we have two branches. The one with the grommet is going to go outside of the heater. The other one is going to come underneath. Now that we have our internal wiring harness situated, the next thing we're going to have to do is we're going to put on the heated air fan. So the heated air fan, the current versions have 3 mounting holes with, of course, 3 holes on the side of the tank, on the side of the case. So we're going to start those. Now the reason we're doing the heated air fan before we do the drain tube, before we do the hood, is because the drain tube, if you remember from our disassembly portion of the video, it actually goes between the 2 water pipes, and then it goes inside of the bracket, the mounting bracket for the heating air fan. So for that reason, the heating air fan is the next part that has to go on. So once the heating air fan is on, now it's time for the drain tube. Now you remember the drain tube has 1 hole down at the bottom, and the bottom and top is, you can tell the difference by the ends. The bottom is open to allow the water to drain out. The top is not open. So you have 1 hole in the bottom, and that interfaces with the solenoid drain valve. Then you have 2 holes on the top, right up here, that actually slip over the combination valve. This is a little bit tricky because this hose, while it's pretty flexible, it doesn't make real tight, small bends. This hose has to be mounted on the combination valve and the drain valve first, set in place, then our cooling hood's going to go on, and then we have to feed this end of the hose through the hole in the cooling hood. So here we go. So the drain hose, I'm going to slip between the pipes here. Then I'm going to route it down here inside of the heating air fan bracket, and then continue it on around to pick up the drain valve and get it into position. Now the easiest way, and you notice I said easiest, not easy, the easiest way to get this tube installed on these nipples, same goes for the drain valve, is you're basically going to pinch the hose above and below the hole, so the hole kind of spreads out a little bit, and you're just going to work it over the fitting on the valve. And I don't think I'm going to be able to get a camera angle to show you how this goes on. But it just takes some persistence. And it's in. So now we're going to put our cooling hood on, and for that we'll just move the pipe out of the way, take our internal harness, Slide that grommet right in there. And we'll use our other hand to try to line up the fuel line. Sometimes you got to put a finger inside of there to get it to line up. You see it coming through. Now your cooling hood is almost ready to be bolted in. The problem is now your drain hose has to go into this little hole in the back of the cooling hood we showed earlier. At this point, you just use your hands to line it up. Now I am always careful not to pop it off of your drain valve again, just because then you don't have to put it back on. Feed it in the hole a little bit. And then line up the hood and bolt it in. So what's left now is the internal wiring harness, this portion of it. We're going to take our 2 solenoid valve wires and plug them in. Brown on the bottom, black on top. And at this point, I'll usually use a pair of needle nose pliers because it is a little bit tucked back there. You do have the drain hose in the way. Now on the solenoid valve, you notice there's 3 pins. There's 2 horizontal and there's 1 vertically oriented pins. We're using the 2 horizontal pins. Tuck this wire back here, plug in our 2 white connectors. Remember, they get tucked into this little metal clip. It just keeps them tidy out of the way. Then we have this 4-pin connector that plugs into the back of the control module for the heated air fan. All right, well now let's put this front cover back on. We do have a gasket that goes on this cooling hood just to keep dust from making its way inside. Now what I do before I put the front cover on is I do loosen these 2 screws right here and here. This little, I call it a snout, is adjustable. You see it moving around. You see it moving around. It's adjustable for this fan. The end of this fan actually rides, you probably won't be able to see it since we're black plastic on black plastic. It rides inside of this groove, so this groove is adjustable. So I loosen that up, I make sure my grommet is seated, then I take my wiring grommet and just work its way into here. This grommet's a little unique in that it does have a step, or almost like a right angle you kind of have to work around to get it to seat in there fully. Once it's in, it's in. Now we're going to guide these 2 pipes through these 2 holes. So again, the one on the left, the inlet side, you can see is just starting to line up. I'll get it lined up, I'll put my finger over the hole, my thumb or whatever over the hole, push it in until I feel the pipe hitting my thumb. Then I'll line up the second one, very gently do the same thing. What I'm really trying to do is I'm trying hard not to allow that grommet to come out. Very gently, slowly, carefully. Now you can see the inlet pipe is sticking proud a little bit. The outlet pipe is there. I put my thumb between and very slowly, I didn't use any sort of lubricant on here. Very slowly push it in. Now you're also, at the same time, watching your fuel line here to make sure it's going to come through the hole. And then just slowly line it all up. Just get everything lined up. And we're going to install the 8 bolts. All right, we're going to put the back cover on. Now, if you were replacing these sensors and switches, you would also be replacing this piece of silicone. Of course, this is just for demonstration purposes, so we're not doing that. Slide it over the two studs, and then you got your simple hex nut. Again, no torque spec, but really, you're just wanting to hold it in place. Now, you take our air temperature sensors and switches. You see there's a notch in this plate, and there's a raised portion on the back cover, and that's where it sits, just like that. We have our two silver screws, and they hold it in place. Now there is a gasket back here. It's this white fiberglass gasket. It just loosely sits right around there. It interfaces with this ridge. Slide your back cover in place and start putting your screws in. And there you have it. There's your dual top disassembly and reassembly.